The 45th floor of the McAllister Tower buzzed with activity as Richard McAllister sat at the head of a mahogany conference table, surrounded by executives in perfectly tailored suits. The morning sun reflected off the glass walls, casting long shadows across the luxurious office space. Despite the prestigious setting, Richard's face betrayed a deep-seated restlessness. The quarterly projections are up by 15%, droned Thomas, the CFO, pointing at charts displayed on the wall-mounted screen. Richard nodded mechanically, his attention drifting to the street below. From this height, people looked like ants, scurrying about their daily lives. He wondered if she was still down there somewhere, among them. The meeting dragged on, but Richard's mind wandered to 20 years ago. The memory hit him with surprising clarity: Lena's small apartment in Queens, the smell of fresh coffee, and morning light filtering through thin curtains. He remembered her warm brown skin against the white sheets, her gentle laugh, the way she'd touch his face when he was stressed about work. "You're going to own this city someday," she'd said, believing in him more than he believed in himself. His stomach churned as the scene shifted to their last interaction. Lena's voice on his answering machine, growing increasingly desperate with each message. "Richard, please. I need to talk to you. It's important." He'd known what it was about. The pregnancy test she'd left on his bathroom counter had said enough. He'd simply changed his number, moved to a different apartment, and thrown himself into his work. Problem solved. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor snapped him back to the present. The meeting was over. Executives filed out, leaving behind coffee cups and scattered papers. Richard remained seated, loosening his tie. The weight of his success felt particularly heavy today. Meanwhile, on a bustling corner of 6th Avenue, a young black man with dreadlocks tied back neatly stood with a guitar case open at his feet. Darnell McAllister, though he used his mother's surname, Williams, positioned himself strategically near the entrance of a popular coffee shop. His fingers moved skillfully across the guitar strings as his voice, rich and soulful, carried over the street noise. The lunch crowd rushed past, some dropping loose change without looking, others completely ignoring him. A businessman in an expensive suit walked by, phone pressed to his ear, looking remarkably like the man in the old photograph his mother kept hidden in her dresser drawer. Darnell's voice didn't waver, but his eyes followed the man until he disappeared into the crowd. He'd been performing on this corner for 3 months now, making barely enough to help his mother with rent. The guitar had been a gift from her on his 18th birthday, bought second-hand, but lovingly restored. "Music will feed your soul," she'd told him, "even when the world doesn't feed your stomach." A young couple stopped to listen, swaying slightly to his rendition of an original song about absent fathers and forgotten promises. The woman smiled, dropped a $5 bill in his case, and they moved on. Darnell nodded his thanks, continuing to play even as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. His mother had always encouraged his music, working double shifts as a nurse to pay for lessons when he was younger. But she never talked about his father, except for one night when she'd had too much wine and let slip that he was someone important now. Darnell had Googled Richard McAllister once, after finding the photograph. The resemblance was undeniable, but so was the gulf between their worlds. As the day wore on, Darnell's voice grew hoarse, but he kept singing. Each song was a story, his story, even if no one stopped long enough to really listen. Above him, the McAllister Tower cast its long shadow across the street, a constant reminder of everything he wasn't meant to have. Richard's phone buzzed during his afternoon meditation session, a new habit his therapist had recommended for stress management. The caller ID showed his head of operations. His chest tightened. Harrison never called unless something had gone wrong. "There's been an accident at the Queens facility," Harrison's voice was tense. A section of scaffolding collapsed during the renovation. 3 workers were injured, 1 critically. Richard's hand gripped the phone tighter. How the hell did this happen? Those safety protocols were supposedly foolproof. Initial reports suggest the contractor may have cut corners to meet deadlines. The press is already outside the building. Channel 7 is running it as their leading story. The meditation cushion fell forgotten as Richard strode to his wall of windows. Far below, he could see the gathering news vans, their satellite dishes like vultures circling a carcass. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now. Not when the company was on the verge of its biggest expansion. "Get our PR team on it," he ordered, but his voice betrayed his anxiety. "And Harrison? Make sure those workers' families have whatever they need." Whatever it takes to keep this contained. After hanging up, Richard caught his reflection in the window, gray threading through his temples, lines deepening around his mouth. He'd worked 30 years to build this empire, starting as a nobody from Brooklyn. One accident could unravel everything. The thought triggered another memory he'd rather forget, Lena telling him she was keeping the baby, that she didn't want his money, just his presence. He'd been so afraid then too, afraid of what a child, a black child, would do to his carefully constructed image. Across town, in a dimly lit bar in Brooklyn, Darnell packed up his guitar after another disappointing performance. The venue had been half empty, and those present seemed more interested in their phones than his music. Marcus, a fellow musician he'd met during open mic nights, approached with 2 beers. "Rough crowd tonight, man," Marcus said, sliding one bottle toward Darnell. "But hey, I got something that might interest you. Remember that producer I told you about? He's organizing a showcase next month. Winner gets a recording contract and 50 grand. Darnell took a long pull from his beer, saying nothing. He'd heard about these opportunities before. They always came with strings attached, hidden costs, broken promises. "You're better than half the acts he signed," Marcus pressed. "Your original stuff. That song about the shadow of the tower. That's real music, man. Raw. Last showcase I entered cost me $300 in entry fees," Darnell replied, packing his guitar with careful movements. "Turned out to be nothing but a scam. This one's different. The producer's legit. Works with Atlantic Records." Marcus pulled out his phone, showing Darnell a glossy website. "Just think about it. You really want to keep playing corners and empty bars forever." Back home, in the small apartment he shared with his mother, Darnell sat on his bed staring at old photographs. His mother had kept every school picture, every certificate, creating a timeline of his life on their living room wall. But it was the hidden photo that drew his attention tonight, the one of his father, younger and smiling, his arm around his mother's waist. They looked happy, normal. Like a real couple. His mother's voice carried from the kitchen, talking on the phone about picking up an extra shift at the hospital. She'd worked double shifts his entire life, ensuring he had everything she could possibly provide. But there had always been an empty space, a father-shaped hole that no amount of love could fill. Opening his laptop, Darnell typed "McAllister Tower accident" into the search bar. News stories were already appearing: 3 workers injured, investigation pending, company spokesperson promising full cooperation. A video showed Richard McAllister entering the building, reporters shouting questions he ignored. Darnell studied the man's face, noting their shared features, the same strong jaw, the same way of walking with their shoulders slightly back. He closed the laptop and picked up his guitar, fingers finding the chords to a new song forming in his mind. One about empires built on forgotten foundations, about men who ran from their shadows, about sons who carried the weight of their father's choices. The night stretched on, and somewhere in the city, both father and son lay awake, unaware that their worlds were about to collide. The charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art represented everything Richard usually excelled at: networking, maintaining appearances, controlling narratives. But tonight, something felt off. Perhaps it was the accident still weighing on his mind, or maybe it was the young reporter from the Times who wouldn't stop hovering nearby. "Mr. McAllister," the reporter finally approached, digital recorder in hand. "James Wilson from the Times. Would you comment on the recent allegations about discriminatory hiring practices in your Queens facility?" Richard maintained his practiced smile, though his fingers tightened around his champagne glass. "I'm afraid you're misinformed, Mr. Wilson. McAllister Industries has one of the most diverse workforces in the industry. Yet records show that while 70% of your manual laborers are people of color, less than 5% of your executive team is non-white." The reporter's eyes held steady. "Including the 3 workers injured in yesterday's accident." The statistical truth hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd built his empire preaching equal opportunity, yet his own boardroom looked exactly like him: white, privileged, safe. Images of Lena flashed through his mind, her working double shifts at his building when they met, her determination to attend night school, her dreams of becoming more than just another black woman cleaning offices. "If you'll excuse me," Richard muttered, pushing past the reporter. He needed air, space, anything to escape the sudden weight of his own hypocrisy. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in Queens, Darnell sat across from his mother at their small kitchen table. Lena's nurse's uniform hung on the back of her chair, ready for her night shift. The local news played quietly in the background, showing footage of the accident at McAllister Industries. "You never talk about him," Darnell said suddenly, his eyes fixed on his mother's face. "Even when I asked as a kid, you'd change the subject." Lena's hands wrapped around her coffee mug, knuckles whitening. "What good would it do? He made his choice a long time ago. Did you love him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with 2 decades of unspoken pain. Lena's eyes grew distant, remembering. "I loved who I thought he was," she finally answered. "A man who saw me as more than just the girl who cleaned his office. Who listened when I talked about my dreams. Who promised." She stopped, shaking her head. "Promises are just pretty words until they're kept. Did he know about me? Really know? I told him. Left messages, wrote letters." Lena's voice hardened. "He had his secretary return the letters unopened. Changed his number. Moved to a different apartment. Rich white men don't want black babies ruining their perfect futures." Darnell absorbed this, his fingers drumming restlessly on the table. "Yet you gave me his last name. On your birth certificate, yes. I thought, maybe someday he'd want to acknowledge you. But I raised you as a Williams, because that's who really loved you." At the accident site, Richard stood in the gathering darkness, staring at the collapsed scaffolding. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the evening breeze. A small shrine of flowers and candles had appeared, placed by the local community for Miguel Rodriguez, the worker still in critical condition. A woman approached, Miguel's wife, Richard realized as his security team tensed. She was small, tired-looking, with 2 young children clutching her hands. "Mr. McAllister," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "The doctors say Miguel may never walk again." Richard felt the words like physical blows. He'd approved the contractor's bid, knowing they'd cut corners to offer the lowest price. He'd signed off on accelerated timelines, ignoring the safety concerns raised by site managers. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he began, but she cut him off. "We don't want your money," she said quietly. "We want you to look at my children and tell them why their father had to risk his life to save your deadline." Richard looked at the children, saw their brown faces streaked with tears, and for a moment, he imagined Darnell at that age, a child he'd never seen, growing up without a father because of choices like the ones that had put Miguel Rodriguez in the hospital. The weight of responsibility, of guilt, of years of calculated indifference, pressed down on him like a physical force. He'd spent decades building walls to protect himself from consequences, but now those same walls were crumbling, revealing the cost of his choices. Darnell stared at the entry form for the Atlantic Records Breakthrough Artist Competition, his cursor hovering over the submit button. The registration fee was steep, $300 he'd scraped together from street performances and late-night bar gigs. His mother's words echoed in his mind, "Sometimes you have to risk everything to become who you're meant to be." The form asked for a personal statement. Darnell's fingers moved across the keyboard. "Music isn't just what I do, it's how I process a world that wasn't built for people like me. Every song I write is a story about survival, about carrying the weight of absent fathers and present struggles. I'm not here for fame. I'm here because silence isn't an option anymore." He clicked submit before doubt could stop him. The confirmation email arrived immediately, performance slot number 147, scheduled for next Friday at the McAllister Center for Performing Arts. The irony wasn't lost on him, his first real shot at success would happen in a building bearing his father's name. Across town, Richard sat in his penthouse office, reviewing the latest press coverage of the accident. His PR team had managed to contain the worst of it, but something about Mrs. Rodriguez's words wouldn't leave him alone. A notification popped up on his screen, his assistant's daily briefing about upcoming events at the McAllister Center. "Atlantic Records Breakthrough Artist Competition," he read aloud, scrolling through the details. His company had sponsored the venue as part of their community outreach initiative, another carefully calculated move to improve their image after the accident. The list of participants caught his eye, particularly entry number 147, Darnell Williams. Something about the promotional photo made him pause. The young man's face struck a familiar chord, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intensity in the eyes. Richard found himself opening his personal safe, pulling out an old envelope he'd kept despite himself. Inside was a single photograph of Lena, taken during happier times, her smile bright and trusting. He held the photo next to the computer screen, comparing features. The resemblance was undeniable. His throat tightened as he realized his son, the child he'd pretended didn't exist, would be performing in his building. Meanwhile, Lena arrived home from her shift to find Darnell practicing in their small living room. The familiar melody stopped when she entered. "I did it, Mom," he said, looking up from his guitar. "I entered the competition." Lena froze, grocery bags still in her hands. "The one at the McAllister Center?" "Yeah." "Why? What's wrong?" She set the bags down slowly, buying time to compose herself. "Baby, there are other venues, other competitions. This is different." "Atlantic Records, Mom." A real shot at a recording contract. He studied her face. "Unless there's another reason you don't want me performing there." Lena sank into her worn armchair, the weight of 2 decades of secrets pressing down on her. "That building, it belongs to your father." "I know," Darnell replied quietly. "I've known for a while now. Found some old articles online, put the pieces together." "Then why?" "Because I'm tired of hiding. Tired of pretending his existence doesn't affect every part of my life." Darnell's fingers traced the worn frets of his guitar. Maybe it's time he knew what he walked away from. Lena watched her son, seeing both the boy she'd raised and the man he'd become. The same quiet determination she'd once admired in Richard now reflected in their son's eyes, but tempered with something Richard had never possessed, genuine empathy. "The competition's next Friday," Darnell continued. "Will you come?" "Baby, I haven't set foot in a McAllister building since." She paused, remembering the day she'd cleared out her cleaning cart, pregnancy test in her pocket, heart in pieces. "I need you there, Mom. Whatever happens." Lena reached for her son's hand, feeling the calluses from years of guitar strings, years of working toward a dream that seemed impossible. "Of course I'll be there. I've never missed a performance, have I?" The moment was interrupted by a news alert on Darnell's phone, another story about the accident at the Queen's facility. The image showed Richard McAllister leaving the hospital, his face haggard. For the first time, Darnell allowed himself to really look at the man who had given him nothing but his DNA, wondering if music would finally bridge the gulf between them. The McAllister Center's auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as performers and industry professionals filled the space. Darnell stood backstage, guitar case in hand, watching through a gap in the curtain as the seats filled. His performance slot was approaching, number 147, just after intermission. A group of contestants huddled nearby, their whispers carrying clearly to where he stood. "Did you see the lineup? Mostly indie rock and pop acts," one said, eyeing Darnell's worn guitar case. "Don't know why they even let the street performers in." "Diversity quota, probably," another replied, smirking. "Got to make it look inclusive for the cameras." Darnell's fingers tightened around his guitar strap, but he kept his face neutral. He'd heard worse on street corners and in dive bars. Success would be his best revenge. In the VIP section, Richard McAllister sat rigid in his seat, program clutched in his hands. He'd arrived late deliberately, choosing a moment when the lobby was nearly empty. His security team had positioned themselves discreetly around the auditorium, a precaution given the recent protests outside his buildings. The lights dimmed for intermission. Richard's eyes scanned the crowd, freezing when he spotted a familiar figure several rows ahead. Lena. 20 years hadn't dimmed her presence, though silver now threaded through her dark hair. She sat straight-backed, hands clasped tightly in her lap, radiating the same quiet dignity he remembered. "And now, contestant number 147, the announcer's voice boomed. Performing an original composition, please welcome Darnell Williams." Richard's breath caught as Darnell walked onto the stage. The young man moved with purpose, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. No flashy outfit or gimmicks, just a black t-shirt, jeans, and a battered guitar that had clearly seen countless performances. When Darnell began to play, the entire auditorium fell silent. His voice, rich with raw emotion, filled the space with a story of absence and presence, of shadows cast by towers that touched the sky while people lived in darkness below. Each verse built upon the last, weaving together themes of privilege, abandonment, and the cost of silence. Richard sat transfixed, recognizing pieces of himself. In the lyrics, the men who chose empire over empathy, success over responsibility. In the spotlight, Darnell's features seemed to shift between stranger and mirror, every expression a reminder of paths not taken. Halfway through the song, a commotion erupted near the front. A group of young men in expensive clothes began jeering, their voices cutting through the music. "Go back to the subway station. This isn't amateur hour. Who let the street rat in?" Security moved to intervene, but the damage was done. The spell was broken. Yet Darnell didn't stop playing. If anything, his voice grew stronger, turning the interruption into fuel for his performance. His eyes swept the audience, briefly meeting Richard's gaze, a moment of recognition that felt like an electric shock. The song ended to scattered applause, punctuated by more derisive comments from the group up front. As Darnell left the stage, a well-dressed man followed him backstage, Jake Morrison, one of the industry's top talent scouts. "Kid, that was something else," Morrison said, offering his card. "Raw talent like yours, we could make something happen. Polish you up a bit, maybe tone down some of the edgier themes." Darnell stared at the card, thinking of all the nights he'd dreamed of exactly this moment. But something in Morrison's tone, the casual suggestion that his truth needed polishing, made him hesitate. "My music is about real people, real struggles," Darnell replied. "It's not meant to be comfortable. Look, I get it. You've got a message. But messages don't sell records." Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Think about it. Opportunity like this doesn't come along every day for, well, you know." The implied meaning hung in the air. Darnell handed the card back, the movement deliberate and final. "Thanks, but I'll take my chances with an audience that wants to hear the whole truth, not just the polished parts." Morrison's expression hardened. "Your loss, kid. Good luck with the street corners." As the talent scout walked away, Darnell caught another glimpse of Richard through the curtain. His father sat alone now, staring at the empty stage with an expression that might have been regret, or might have been simple discomfort. Either way, it was too late for easy answers. After the competition, Richard found himself lingering in the center's lobby, watching Darnell pack his guitar near the exit. His security team hovered nearby, awaiting instructions. 20 years of practice distance could end with just a few steps across the polished floor. Before he could move, Lena intercepted him. "Don't," she said quietly, positioning herself between Richard and their son. Her nurse's ID badge still hung from her jacket, she'd come straight from her shift. "You lost the right to approach him the day you sent back those letters unopened." Richard glanced around, conscious of potential onlookers. "Lena, I know I handled things badly. Badly." Her laugh was sharp, brittle. "You disappeared. Changed your number. Had your lawyers make it clear that any attempt to contact you would result in legal action." She stepped closer, voice dropping. "Do you know what it's like to tell a 5-year-old why he can't make a Father's Day card? To explain to a teenager why his college fund consists of my overtime shifts?" Security shifted uncomfortably, but Richard waved them back. "I want to make things right." "Right." Lena's eyes flashed. "There's a difference between right and convenient, Richard. The accident at your facility, the press coverage about discrimination, suddenly you're interested in the black son you pretended didn't exist. How convenient." The truth of her words stung. His recent interest in Darnell had started after the accident, after the press began questioning his company's commitment to diversity. Was this just another PR move, even in his own mind? "He's talented," Richard said finally. "He deserves opportunities. Which he's earned on his own," Lena cut in. "Every callus on his fingers, every song in his heart, that's from years of work you had no part in. You don't get to walk in now and play proud father." Across the lobby, Darnell had noticed the confrontation. He stood frozen, guitar case in hand, watching his parents interact for the first time in his memory. Other performers and audience members streamed past, some beginning to recognize Richard, phones appearing to capture the moment. "Is everything okay, Mom?" Darnell approached slowly, his voice controlled despite the tension visible in his shoulders. Lena started to speak, but Richard stepped forward. "Darnell, I'm Richard McAllister. I'm your dash." "I know who you are," Darnell interrupted. "I've known for years. Wasn't hard to figure out, once I started looking." The three stood in a triangle of tension, decades of unspoken words hanging between them. Security guards shifted nervously as more phones turned their way, the potential for a scandal growing with each passing second. "Your performance tonight," Richard began again, "it was extraordinary." "It was honest," Darnell replied. "Something you might want to try sometime." He turned to his mother. "Ready to go, Mom? I've got an early shift tomorrow." "Darnell, please," Richard reached out, but stopped short of actually touching him. "I'd like a chance to explain." "Explain?" Darnell's laugh echoed his mother's earlier brittleness. "What's to explain? You made a choice. My whole life is the result of that choice. The only difference is now you're feeling guilty because your company's in the headlines for the wrong reasons." Richard flinched. "That's not Dash." "Save it for your PR team," Darnell cut in. "I'm sure they can spin it into something nice and corporate-friendly. Local magnate reconnects with estranged son, proves commitment to diversity." Great headline, right? The gathering crowd had grown, smartphones recording every word. Richard's security team moved closer, ready to intervene, but Richard himself seemed to shrink under the weight of his son's words. Lena touched Darnell's arm gently. "Come on, baby. We've said enough." As they turned to leave, Richard called out one last time. "I was wrong. About everything. I know that now." Darnell paused, looked back. Knowing is easy. Living with the consequences, that's the hard part. But hey, at least you had a choice. Mom and I just had to live with it. Mother and son walked out of the building, leaving Richard standing in the lobby of his own performing arts center, surrounded by whispers and camera phones, feeling more alone than ever in his tower of success. 3 weeks after the competition, Darnell found himself at the front of a protest outside McAllister Industries' main office. The demonstrators, a mix of social justice activists, union organizers, and community members, carried signs demanding accountability for the scaffolding accident and equal employment opportunities. Miguel Rodriguez's family stood nearby, their presence a stark reminder of corporate negligence's human cost. "McAllister built his fortune on our backs," a union organizer shouted through a megaphone. Darnell had connected with the group through social media after his confrontation with Richard went viral. His performance and subsequent exchange with his father had racked up millions of views, turning him into an unexpected symbol of resistance. Darnell pulled out his guitar, starting a melody that had been building in his mind since the competition. The crowd quieted, recognizing him from the viral video. His new song, raw and unfiltered, spoke of broken scaffolding and broken promises, of towers built on foundations of privilege while workers risked their lives on unstable platforms. Inside the tower, Richard watched the gathering crowd from his office window. His PR team huddled around a conference table behind him, strategizing damage control. "We need to show immediate action," Sarah, his head of communications, insisted. "The video of your confrontation with your son has completely changed the narrative. We're not just dealing with a workplace accident anymore, this is about systemic inequality, about personal responsibility." Richard continued staring down at the protest. Darnell's voice carried faintly through the reinforced glass, each word a precise strike at the empire Richard had built. "I'm announcing a new diversity initiative," Richard said suddenly, turning from the window. $50 million for minority education programs, scholarships, job training. "With all due respect, sir," Harrison interjected, throwing money at the problem. "Is exactly what I've always done," Richard finished. "But this time it'll be different. I'm stepping down as CEO." The room erupted in protests, but Richard held up his hand. "Temporarily. I'm going to work on the ground floor. Start with the cleaning crew, like I did 30 years ago. Like Lena did." His team exchanged worried glances. "The board won't like this," Sarah warned. "The board doesn't have to like it. They just have to understand that without real change, we'll lose everything anyway." Outside, the protest had grown. Darnell's music had drawn more people, including local news crews. He'd stopped playing now, listening as Miguel Rodriguez's wife addressed the crowd in Spanish, her words translated by her teenage daughter. "They offer us money," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, as if dollars can replace dignity. "My husband worked for this company for 15 years. Now he cannot walk, cannot hold his children. Where was their concern for diversity and safety before? Darnell stepped forward to support her as she broke down, her daughter continuing the translation through tears. The crowd's energy shifted from angry to somber, the human cost of corporate negligence impossible to ignore. A ripple of surprise moved through the protesters as the building's main doors opened. Richard McAllister emerged, without his usual security detail. He wore a simple shirt and slacks instead of his customary suit, looking oddly vulnerable in the morning light. The crowd's reaction was immediate: shouts, jeers, phones raising to capture whatever would happen next. But Richard didn't approach the protesters. Instead, he walked to the service entrance at the side of the building, where cleaning staff were starting their morning shift. Without a word, he picked up a mop and bucket. Darnell watched his father through narrowed eyes, trying to decode this latest move. Was it genuine remorse or another calculated PR stunt? The protest continued around him, but his focus remained on Richard, who was now cleaning floors alongside the same workers he'd spent decades overlooking. "He's trying to manipulate the narrative," a fellow activist muttered. "Make himself look humble and relatable." "Maybe," Darnell replied, but something in his voice had changed. "Or maybe he's finally learning what it means to see eye to eye with people instead of looking down from above." The protest stretched into the afternoon. Some demonstrators left, others arrived. Through it all, Richard continued working, speaking quietly with his cleaning crew colleagues, listening more than talking. Darnell played his new song 3 more times, each performance drawing more attention online, spreading their message beyond the single protest. By sunset, both father and son were exhausted, though neither would admit it. They hadn't spoken directly, but something had shifted in the space between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in a wall built over 20 years. The small coffee shop in Queens was neutral territory, far from both the gleaming McAllister Tower and the modest neighborhood where Darnell grew up. Richard arrived first, dressed down in khakis and a polo shirt, his 5th day of working from the ground up in his own company. His hands were slightly raw from work, a detail he didn't try to hide. Darnell walked in 10 minutes late, guitar case strapped to his back. He'd come straight from a morning street performance, his tip jar notably fuller since his protest songs had gone viral. The coffee shop patrons pretended not to stare as he sat across from his father, the tension between them almost visible in the morning light. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Richard said, pushing a black coffee across the table. He'd remembered Lena always took hers black. "Neither was I," Darnell replied, accepting the coffee but not drinking it. "Mom doesn't know I'm here." The admission hung between them. Richard nodded, understanding the weight of secrets kept from Lena. He'd spent 20 years perfecting that particular skill. "Your protest songs," Richard started, then paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound corporate or rehearsed. "They're making people uncomfortable. Including me." "Good," Darnell's response was immediate. "Comfort is what let you ignore people like Miguel Rodriguez until he fell from your scaffolding. It's what let you walk away from Mom without looking back." Richard's fingers tightened around his own cup. "I was 28 when your mother told me she was pregnant. I'd just secured my first major development deal. The investors, they had certain expectations about the face of their company. So you chose the investors over your own blood." Darnell's voice was level, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "You know what's funny? Every time I played on the street outside your building, I kept thinking maybe you'd walk by, recognize something in my face. But you never even looked down, did you?" "I looked," Richard admitted quietly. "Every time I heard music from the street, I looked. But I trained myself not to see. The same way I trained myself not to see a lot of things." A group of customers entered the shop, their chatter momentarily drowning out the weight of 2 decades of silence. When they settled, Darnell spoke again. "Mom worked 3 jobs to put me through music school. Did you know that? She'd come home with her hands cracked from cleaning chemicals, but she'd still help me practice. Never complained, never asked for anything. Just kept telling me that talent means nothing without hard work." Richard stared into his coffee, seeing reflections of choices made and paths not taken. "She was always the stronger one. I used to watch her study for her night classes after her cleaning shift. She had such dreams." "Dreams you helped kill," Darnell cut in. "You know what she told me when I asked about you as a kid? She said sometimes people choose to be ghosts because it's easier than being human." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Outside the coffee shop window, the morning crowd hurried past, office workers, students, cleaning staff. All the people he'd spent years looking past from his tower view. "I can't change the past," Richard said finally. "No one's asking you to," Darnell replied. "But you can't buy your way out of it either. All your new diversity initiatives, your temporary CEO step down, it means nothing if you don't understand why it's necessary." "Then help me understand," Richard's voice cracked slightly. "Tell me what it was like. All of it." For a moment, Darnell just stared at him, searching for sincerity in features so similar to his own. Then he began to speak. He told Richard about the father-son events he'd attended alone, about watching other kids get picked up by their dads while he waited for his mom's bus. About Googling the McAllister name and seeing his own eyes staring back from corporate photos, wondering if anyone else noticed the resemblance. Richard listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his life. Each word from his son's mouth carved new lines in his face, etching the cost of his choices into his skin. "I don't expect forgiveness," Richard said when Darnell finally fell silent. "I haven't earned it." "No," Darnell agreed, standing up. "You haven't. But maybe that's not the point anymore. Maybe it's about what you do with the truth now that you can't pretend not to see it." He left his coffee untouched, walking out of the shop with his guitar case held high. Through the window, Richard watched him go, feeling both lighter and heavier than he had in 20 years. The police precinct buzzed with activity at 2 a.m., fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across tired faces. Richard sat in the waiting area, his casual work clothes still dusty from his shift with the cleaning crew. The past week of working from the bottom up had changed him. His hands were calloused, his designer watch replaced by a simple digital timepiece. Detective Martinez approached with a clipboard. "Mr. McAllister, your son was arrested during the protest at the Queens construction site. Trespassing and civil disobedience." Richard stood, fighting the urge to simply throw money at the problem like he always had. "Is he okay?" Him and 20 other protesters. They chained themselves to the new scaffolding, demanding safety inspections. Martinez checked his notes. He was leading them in some kind of protest song when we arrived. Through the holding area doors, Richard could hear familiar guitar chords and multiple voices singing. Even in jail, Darnell was making himself heard. "I can post bail," Richard started, but Martinez shook his head. "Already been handled. His mother's in there now, filling out the paperwork." As if summoned by her mention, Lena emerged from the holding area, her nurse's uniform wrinkled from a double shift. She stopped short at the sight of Richard. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was tired, lacking its usual edge. "The company security team alerted me about the arrest." Richard stepped forward. "Lena, I need to tell you something. About why I left back then. Now. You want to do this now?" She glanced at the holding area doors. "Our son is in jail, Richard. Because of me. Because of choices I made before he was even born." Richard's voice cracked. "When you told me you were pregnant, I just made a deal with investors who, they made it clear that their support depended on my image. A black girlfriend, a mixed-race child, it didn't fit their vision of success. So you chose their vision over us." Lena's words were quiet but cutting. "I chose wrong. Every day since then, I chose wrong." Richard ran a hand through his graying hair. "I told myself it was about business, about building something important. But I was just a coward hiding behind dollar signs." The holding area doors opened again, and Darnell emerged, escorted by an officer. His guitar had been confiscated as evidence, but he stood tall, unrepentant. "Both of you came." He looked between his parents, surprise briefly breaking through his defiant expression. "Baby, what were you thinking?" Lena moved to hug him, checking for injuries. "Chaining yourself to scaffolding." "I was thinking about Miguel Rodriguez's kids growing up without their father walking." Darnell's eyes met Richard's. "About how some fathers choose to disappear, and others get taken away by corporate negligence." Richard stepped forward. "The construction site is being completely renovated. New safety protocols, union-approved contractors dash." After someone nearly died, Darnell cut in. "After protesters had to shame you into doing the right thing. Just like it took viral videos and bad press to make you acknowledge your own son." The precinct's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as silence fell between them. A desk sergeant coughed awkwardly, pretending not to listen. "You're right," Richard said finally. "I've spent my life reacting to pressure instead of acting on principle. But I'm trying to change that." "Trying isn't enough anymore," Darnell replied. "Not for Miguel's family, not for the workers who risk their lives in your buildings, and not for us." Lena touched her son's arm. "Let's go home, baby. You need rest." "Actually," Richard interrupted, "I'd like to show you both something. If you'll come with me." Mother and son exchanged glances. After a moment, Darnell nodded. "Lead the way, Mr. McAllister." The use of his formal name stung, but Richard accepted it as part of his penance. As they left the precinct, the night sky was just beginning to lighten with pre-dawn gray. A new day was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. The pre-dawn drive took them to the Queen's construction site where Darnell had been arrested hours earlier. Richard's security team had cleared the area, leaving only the ghostly silhouettes of scaffolding against the lightening sky. He led them to a makeshift office, flipping on lights to reveal walls covered with blueprints and documents. "Before I show you this," Richard began, his hand hovering over a particular folder, "I need you both to understand something. What I'm about to share isn't an attempt to buy forgiveness or manipulate the situation. It's about finally doing what I should have done 20 years ago." He pulled out a thick legal document and handed it to Darnell. "This is the original ownership structure of McAllister Industries. When I started the company, I created a trust that would hold 30% of the shares for my firstborn child." Darnell stared at the papers, his hands trembling slightly. "What?" "I never dissolved it," Richard continued, watching his son's face carefully. "Even after I walked away, I couldn't bring myself to undo it." "Which means you, Darnell, have been the legal owner of nearly a third of this company since the day you were born." Lena stepped forward, her nurse's pragmatism cutting through the shock. "Why tell him this now?" "Because tomorrow morning, I'm announcing a complete restructuring of McAllister Industries. The company will be divided into two entities. The Construction and Development Division will remain under the current board's control, but the new McAllister Community Development Fund will be independently managed." Richard turned to his son. "With your shares, you'll have controlling interest in the fund." Darnell laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So this is your solution? Try to solve everything with money again?" "No," Richard replied firmly. "This is about legacy. Not my legacy, yours. The fund will focus on affordable housing, arts education, worker safety programs, everything we should have been doing all along. You can use it to make real change, or you can sell the shares and walk away. Either way, the choice will be yours, something I never gave you before." The silence that followed was heavy with 2 decades of absence. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows through the construction site. "And what about Mom?" Darnell's voice was carefully controlled. "What does she get for all the years she spent raising me alone?" "I can never repay your mother for what I took from her," Richard admitted, turning to Lena. "But I've transferred ownership of the McAllister Center for Performing Arts to a new board of directors. You're the chairperson, Lena, if you want it. The center will become a nonprofit focused on arts education for underprivileged youth." Lena's face remained impassive, but her hands clasped together tightly. "You think this makes up for everything?" "No," Richard shook his head. "Nothing can make up for what I did. This isn't about making amends, it's about trying to ensure that the next 20 years aren't wasted like the last 20 were." Darnell looked down at the documents again, then out at the construction site where he'd been arrested hours earlier. "You know what's ironic? All those years I spent playing on street corners, writing songs about towers and shadows. I never wanted your money. I just wanted you to see me. To acknowledge that I existed." "I know," Richard's voice cracked. "I saw you every day in the mirror, in board meetings, in every decision I made. I just didn't have the courage to admit it." The sun had fully risen now, illuminating the three of them in the harsh light of morning. They stood in a triangle of shared blood and separate lives, each holding a piece of a future none of them had imagined. "This doesn't fix anything," Darnell said finally, setting the documents down. "But maybe it's a place to start." Lena reached for her son's hand, then, after a moment's hesitation, extended her other hand to Richard. "Not a fresh start," she corrected. We can't erase the past. But maybe a new chapter. Richard took her offered hand, feeling the roughness of years of hard work against his palm. Through the office window, workers were beginning to arrive for the morning shift, including several faces he now knew from his week working alongside them. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but full of possibilities. Not a happy ending, those only existed in fairy tales, but perhaps something more valuable, a chance to build something real from the ruins of what had been broken.